By the seventh winter she had forgotten her own voice. A Lakota chief waited till she spoke. The pipe had gone cold in my hands before I noticed. I was sitting outside the lodge, east facing the way a man does when he wants to be honest with the morning, and I had filled the bowl and lit it and drawn twice, and then my thoughts had gone somewhere else entirely, and the tobacco had gone out, and I was just sitting there holding a cold pipe and watching the frost come up off the creek in thin white threads. That was the winter I am trying to tell you about, the seventh one. She had come to us in spring. A wagon had broken apart on the crossing, not an accident, but a collapse, the way a thing collapses when it has been pushed past what it was made for. 3 men dead in the river. 1 woman left. My scouts found her 2 days later walking east on foot, carrying nothing but a blanket and a child's shoe. No child, just the shoe. I did not ask about the shoe for a long time. Her name, she told my interpreter Chetan, was Margaret Alois Voss, and she was from a town in Ohio that none of us had heard of, and she had a husband buried on the Platte and a daughter buried somewhere she couldn't name, because it had happened in the dark and in the moving water, and she had not known north from south, had not known anything at all, for a time. We gave her a lodge, we gave her food. We gave her Winona's company, because Winona was my mother's sister and the most patient woman I had ever known. She could sit with a broken thing for as long as it took, without pushing, without filling the silence with anything that wasn't earned. For 3 days, Margaret Alois Voss sat inside the lodge and did not speak. On the 4th day she came out and asked, through Chetan, if there was something she could do. That was the beginning of what she was then. Useful. That was the first word that fit her. She was not a woman who could bear to be still and receive. She learned to tan a hide. She learned which roots were which. She learned to cook over a fire without a stove and without measurements, by touch and by smell, the way you have to learn things when the world stops giving you the tools you were raised with. Some things she learned wrong at first and corrected without complaint. Some things she learned faster than women who had been doing them for 20 years, which she did not comment on, but you could see it sitting somewhere in her when she was working, not pride exactly, but a quiet recognition that her body could still learn, still adapt, still carry her somewhere. She was a fast learner. That surprised some of the women at first. Then it stopped surprising them because they realized it wasn't cleverness, it was desperation made useful. She had nowhere else to put herself. I watched all this from where chiefs watch things, from a distance, usually, now and then close when it was necessary. The first time I was close to her was in the 2nd month. She had gotten into trouble at the river, not danger, but a bad moment. The current had taken her washing downstream and she'd gone in after it, knee-deep, and then the ground had dropped off the way it does on that bend and she was suddenly chest-deep, and holding a soaked blanket, and her face had gone a particular color that wasn't cold. It was the other thing, the thing from the crossing. I was downstream and I waded in and took the blanket from her and handed her back to the bank. That was all. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. She stood on the bank and shook, and I waited until her legs looked like her own again, and then I walked back to where I'd come from. But I had seen her face. There are men who can look at a woman's face and see nothing. I am not that man. I never was. My wife, Tatanka Wynne, she used to say I looked at people the way you look at a river, trying to read where the deep parts were. She thought it was a gift. I thought it was just what I was made to be, a reader of water. Tatanka Wynne had been gone 3 years by then. I am not going to tell you much about that, because some things a man keeps. But I will say this. When you lose the woman who chose you, the woman who saw you whole, not the chief, not the war leader, but the particular man inside all that, when you lose her, there is a quiet that settles in that is not like any other quiet. It doesn't feel like grief after a while. It feels like you have simply become a smaller version of yourself, and you have accepted that, and you are living in that smaller version, and it is enough. It was enough. I had told myself it was enough for 3 years. The girl, I thought of her as the girl for a long time. Though she was not young, She was maybe 30, maybe a little more, with the kind of face that work had made older than her years. She stayed. That first spring, then the summer, then the fall, and then she was with us for a winter, and it was plain she was not going anywhere. The child's shoe she kept inside her blanket. I knew this because Winona told me. I did not speak of it. She learned Lakota slowly, the way you would expect, haltingly, with mistakes, with a kind of fierce concentration that was almost painful to watch. But she learned it. By the end of the first year, she could say most of what she needed to say without chatting in between. By the middle of the second year, she could have a real conversation. A real one, with disagreement in it, with uncertainty, with the quick corrections a person makes mid-sentence when they find a better word. That is when you know someone has the language, not when they can order food or report on the weather, but when they can change their mind in front of you and the words catch up. It was in that second year that I spoke to her directly for the first time, not through Chetan, not through the buffer of translation, just the two of us, in broken Lakota on her side, and occasionally some of the English words I knew on mine. I had gone to the edge of camp where she was working with one of the older women, scraping a hide that had dried wrong. She was correcting it, going over the mistake, patient, not frustrated. I watched for a minute without her seeing me, and then she looked up and saw me watching, and she didn't flinch the way she used to. She just looked at me, waiting. I said in Lakota, "You are doing that wrong." She said, "I know, I am fixing it." "How do you know it's wrong?" She held up her hands, the tips of her fingers. "I can feel where it's hard, where it should not be hard." I looked at her hands for a moment. They were not the hands she had arrived with. They were a working woman's hands now, cracked at the knuckles, stained. I nodded and I walked away, and I thought about that for 3 days. The way she said it, "I can feel where it's hard." There is a kind of attention that a person can have, a real attention, not the performance of attention but the actual thing, the body attending, and it is rare. My father had it. Tatanka Wynn had it. And this woman who had come to us out of the river, this woman from Ohio, had it. She had learned to read the world through her hands because the world she'd been born into had been taken away. And so she had grown new instruments for it, quiet and accurate. She stayed. That was the second year. Then the third. Then the fourth. I will tell you something about the third year in particular, because there was a moment in it that I have carried in a different pocket from the rest. It was a late summer evening, the kind where the light goes gold and flat across the grass, and everything looks like something you should remember. She was sitting with 3 of the women outside Winona's lodge, all of them doing something with their hands, Winona's beadwork, the others with hides and sinew, and Margaret was talking. I don't know what they were talking about. I was too far away to hear, but I could see her hands moving in that way she had when she was telling something. And the women were listening, and one of them laughed, and Margaret laughed too, her whole face going into it the way people laugh when they have forgotten to monitor themselves. I had not seen her laugh like that before, without watching herself. I stood and looked at that for a moment, maybe longer than I should have, and then I walked the other direction because it was not something I wanted to be caught studying. But I thought about it later, lying in the lodge in the dark. The thing that happens when a person forgets to watch themselves, the real thing coming through. Then the fourth. The town had long since given up on her. If there was anyone left who had known her in Ohio, they had written her for dead. Maybe she had written herself for dead too, in some part. She stopped talking about where she had come from, stopped using English except when she had to. There were children in camp who had learned their first words partly from her, which meant they learned them in the wrong order sometimes, mixed Lakota and English in ways that made the older women laugh. She was one of us, in the ways that matter, in the ways that you can be when you are built to be something else but the world has remade you. But here is what I am trying to get to. Around the 5th year, the 5th winter, when the hunting had been poor and we had lost 2 elders and there was a weight on everything, I started to notice something was going wrong with her. Not sickness, Not sadness exactly, something harder to name. She went quieter. Now she had never been loud, but she had always been present in a certain way, had always had something to say when she wanted to say it, had that particular directness that I had come to think was simply what she was. And slowly, across that winter, the directness began to go away. She deferred. She pulled back. She waited for other women to speak before she would speak, and then sometimes she didn't speak at all, just nodded. At meals she took less than her share, and no one noticed except me and Winona. And we looked at each other across the fire, and neither of us said anything that night. Winona said to me one evening, "The river woman is disappearing." I asked what she meant. "I mean," Winona said, "she is practicing becoming nothing. She thinks she is honoring us by making herself small. She does not understand that smallness is not honor." I thought about that for a long time. I think what had happened, and I say this knowing I am only a man and I could be wrong, is that she had worked so hard to belong, to be useful, to not be the outsider who takes more than she gives, that she had filed herself down past the point of herself. She had been afraid for years that taking up space was an imposition, that having a voice was a presumption, that she, specifically she, this woman from Ohio who had come to us out of disaster, did not have the right to simply speak. And so she had gone quiet, the way a fire goes quiet when you stop feeding it. She was still doing the work. That did not stop. The hands never stopped. But the person behind the hands was receding, pulling back into some interior place that was getting smaller, and I had watched enough things disappear in my life to know what disappearing looked like, and to know that you had a window, and the window closed. By the 6th winter it was worse. She barely talked at all. When I looked at her face, which I did more often now, I saw something I recognized from the first time I had really looked at her. At the river, when the current had taken her, that color that was not cold. She was drowning again, without water. I want to tell you what I did, and I want to be honest about why. I am not a man who explains himself much. People who have to explain themselves a great deal are usually trying to convince someone, and I don't have patience for convincing. You either see a thing or you don't. But I want to be honest here because what I did came from a particular place in me, and that place had a name, and the name was loneliness. Not the general loneliness of a man without a wife. I had made my peace with that, but the specific loneliness of watching something disappear that you had noticed was valuable, and knowing that if you didn't act, it would be gone. I had been in that quiet of mind for 3 years by then, that smaller version of myself, and I had told myself it was enough, and mostly it was. But I had been watching this woman for 5 years, and I had seen what she was, the real thing underneath the hard work and the silence, and I knew that the world was getting smaller by the amount of her, and I was not going to let that happen. So one morning in the deep of the 6th winter, when the sky was the color of old iron and the snow was packed hard enough to walk on without leaving prints, I went to the lodge where she was staying. She had been given her own by then, a small one, and she had made it into something of her own, hung things she'd made, kept it ordered in the particular way she ordered things, not our way, not her old Ohio way, some third way she'd arrived at that was hers, and I stood outside and said in Lakota, "Come walk with me." She came out. She was wearing the heavy elk robe that Winona had made for her, and her hair was braided in the way the women had taught her, and she looked at me with those careful eyes that had learned not to give too much. We walked down to the creek and stood by the water, which was frozen at the edges but still moving in the middle. I didn't say anything for a while. This is a thing I have learned. Silence with a purpose is different from silence with an absence, and people can feel the difference. I was not empty when I was quiet. I was there. Finally she said, very low, "What do you need me to do?" And I turned and looked at her and I said, "Nothing. I need you to talk to me." She looked at the water. "I don't have much to say." "You have plenty to say. You have stopped saying it." She went still in a way that meant I had found the thing. She did that sometimes. You would say a true thing and she would go very still, like a bird that has heard a sound and is deciding whether to fly. "It is not my place," she said. "Whose place is it?" She didn't answer. I sat down on a log at the creek's edge, even though the cold was something you felt in your back teeth, and I said, "Sit." She sat. We looked at the water. After a while I said, "My wife used to tell me things that other people were afraid to say to me, because of what I am, because of how people look at a chief, like he already knows everything and you would be a fool to try to tell him something." She never looked at me that way. She looked at me like a man she had decided to trust, and she told me what she actually thought. I stopped. This was more than I usually said about Tatanka Win. "I have not had anyone do that," I said, "in 3 years." She looked at me then, not the way she looked at the water. A different way. "You talk to everyone," she said. "I talk to everyone and I talk to no one. You know the difference." She did know. I could see that she knew. "I don't want to say the wrong thing," she said. "You have been here 6 years. That doesn't mean—" Margaret. I hadn't used her name in a long time. It sat strangely in my mouth, the English sounds in it, the 2 hard syllables, but I said it. "You stopped speaking because you were afraid of taking up space. I am asking you to take up space. I am telling you there is space for you." She looked at the moving water in the center of the creek. Her jaw worked a little, the way jaws do when someone is keeping something behind their teeth. Then she said, "The shoe belonged to Clara, she was 4. We had just started across when the tongue broke on the front wheel and the wagon went sideways, and the river," she stopped, "started again. I had her in both hands, and the current it was the kind of current you can't fight with your arms, not with a child on top of you. And I had one hand on the side of the wagon and one hand on her ankle, and I had to choose which hand to use for myself." Her voice didn't break. It went flatter, the way voices go when something is too large for grief. "I chose wrong. I held the wagon. I held the wrong thing." We sat there. The creek moved. I reached over and put my hand on top of her 2 hands, which were folded together in her lap. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. She made a sound, not crying, something before crying, something underneath it, and she put her forehead down on the back of my hand and stayed there. I sat very still. The cold was bad. Neither of us moved. After a long time she lifted her head, and she looked at the water again, and she said, "I have been thinking about her every day for 6 years, and this is the first time I have said her name out loud. Clara." She looked at me. "Clara," I said again. And she started crying then. Finally, the real kind, not the flat kind, and I did not move my hand. We walked back to camp when she was done. She didn't apologize for the crying. That was the first sign that something had shifted. She didn't make herself small after. She just walked beside me in the iron sky cold, and when we got back she went into her lodge and I went to mine. That evening Winona came and sat with me and didn't say anything for a while, which meant she was going to say something pointed. "The river woman was crying today," she said. "Yes." "The good kind." "Yes." Winona looked at the fire. "You look different." I didn't say anything. "You look like a man who remembered something," she said. "I thought about that, or woke up to something." She nodded, like that was the same thing. The winter went on, they do. But something had broken open, in her, yes, but also in me, and I was honest enough with myself to admit it. I had gone to that creek in the 6th winter partly for her, and partly because I had needed someone to sit with in the cold and not require anything from me except to be there. I had needed to say Tatanka Win's name to someone who would just hear it, who wouldn't try to fill the space after it with comfort. Margaret had done that. She had let it stand. She had understood that some things you just let stand. She started talking again, carefully at first, then with more of herself in it. She would find me in the evenings sometimes when the day's work was done, and we would walk, or we would sit, and she would say what was actually in her head. She argued with me once about where to move the winter camp. She had some ideas about the eastern creek bed and the wind patterns, and she laid them out flat, without apology, and she was half right, which I told her, and she looked at me with something bright in her eyes and said in Lakota that was by now very good, "Only half. The east wind is worse than you think." "How much worse?" "Come to the ridge in the morning and I'll show you." She came to the ridge in the morning. She was right about some of it, and I told her so, which she accepted without making too much of it, and I showed her the eastern draw where the wind came funneled and mean off the flat, and she stood there with her hair whipping and her eyes watering from the cold, and she said, "All right. You were right about the east wind." Then after a pause, "How do you know things like that? From riding them or?" "From being wrong about them first," I said. "I camped in that draw once when I was young. I have not made that mistake again." She thought about that. "That's how most real knowledge works." "Yes. People don't say that enough." "No, they prefer to make it sound like they knew all along." She looked at me sideways, something almost amused in it, and we stood there a while longer before the cold drove us back down. That became a thing we did. I want to say what it was clearly, because I think men my age are bad at saying what a thing is when the thing is tender. We prefer to let it go unnamed, prefer to act as if the tenderness is incidental to the practical. We are going to the ridge for the wind, not for each other's company. This is a lie we tell ourselves, and we know it is a lie, and we tell it anyway because naming the tender thing means you can also lose it, and loss is something you have already learned to understand too well. I had lost Tatanka Win. I had lost 2 sons before they were old enough to carry their own weight. I had lost men who had followed me and believed in me, and I had led them somewhere that cost them everything. I had stood at graves and at riversides and at burning places, and I had been the man who stayed upright when everything wanted to lay him down. Loss was not new to me. Loss was part of the territory. But I was 51 years old, and I was sitting on a ridge at dawn with a woman from Ohio who had survived the same kind of losses, and who was, I had come to understand, one of the few people I had ever known who could be fully present with another person, without needing to reshape them into something more comfortable. She didn't want me to be smaller. She didn't want me to be softer. She didn't need me to perform wisdom or strength or leadership. She just saw me. The way Tatanka Win had seen me. The way you spend most of your life hoping someone will, and most of your life learning not to need. I did not say any of this to her. Not yet. I am a slow man. I come to things the long way. What happened was the 7th winter. The 7th winter came hard. An early hard freeze, then a thaw that made the creek treacherous, then another freeze that locked everything solid before the camp was properly provisioned. I had miscalculated, not badly, not fatally, but enough that we were short, and that shortness meant choices, and choices in a hard winter mean someone goes without. I was the chief, I went without. This is not a thing I say for praise. It is what you do when you are responsible for people. You eat last. You sleep cold. You give your robe to the elder whose lodge is leaking, and you patch the leak with your hands in the dark, and you don't sleep that night. You check on the children first and the horses second and yourself somewhere after that when there is a moment, which sometimes there isn't. That is what the position is. Not glory, responsibility, the kind that grinds. I had been doing this for 23 years and I knew the shape of it. What I had not accounted for this particular winter was that I had gotten older, and the cold now took things from me that it hadn't taken 10 years ago. The feet took longer to warm. The sleep was shallower. The body's ability to simply absorb and continue had become something I had to negotiate with rather than rely on. I did not advertise this. You don't if you are what I am. But I knew it. By midwinter I was worn down. I won't dress it up. I was running short on sleep and short on food, and short on the kind of quiet a man needs to stay level. Because in a hard winter there is no quiet. There is only problem after problem laid on top of problem. And you solve each one and pick up the next, and you keep going because there is no alternative to keeping going that you are willing to accept. One morning I woke up, and I could not feel my feet. This happens. Cold does it. You warm them and they come back, usually. But I lay there in the lodge and looked at the smoke hole and thought, I am not certain I can get up. Not the cold kind of can't, the other kind. I had felt this before, after the battle at the river crossing, after Tatanka win. That place, a man gets to where the body is willing but the will has gone somewhere else and left no message. I had always gotten up before. I had always found the floor and put my feet on it and stood, because there were people counting on the standing, and that had been enough. That morning I lay there longer than I should have, looking at the smoke hole, and I thought about the provisions and the people and the list of things that needed doing, and normally that list was enough to get me vertical, but that morning the list just sat there, not moving me. The door of the lodge opened. I didn't hear her come in. She moves quietly, and she always knocked, always waited to be acknowledged before entering anywhere. But that morning she came straight in the way you come straight into a place when something has told you to hurry, and she crossed to where I was lying and crouched down and looked at my face. Her hair was loose. She'd come from sleep, or close to it. Something had woken her and sent her here. She put her hand on my forehead, not checking for fever, just placing her hand there, the way you would with a person you were trying to call back from somewhere they had gotten too far into. I couldn't sleep, she said in Lakota. I kept thinking of you. I looked at her. You have been giving everything away for 2 months, she said. Your food, your robe, your sleep. She said the last word with something in it that was almost anger but pointed inward at herself for not having come sooner. You are a man, not a mountain. You run out. I said, I will get up. I know you will, but first lie still and let me do something. She went to the fire and built it up. She knew how my lodge worked where I kept the wood, had been in here 100 times on one errand or another. And then she went out and came back with food, real food, the kind she had been setting aside somewhere, some reserve of hers. I didn't know when she had built it or how, and she sat beside me and she said, Eat. I tried to say I wasn't hungry. She looked at me the way Winona sometimes looked at me, which was a look that made clear that certain arguments were not going to be entertained. I ate. When I was done, she took the bowl and she sat beside me, not across, not at a respectful distance, but beside me, close, the way you sit with someone you have decided you are entitled to be close to, and she said, You let me keep talking to Clara, all these months since the creek. You sat with all of that and you never once asked me to carry it somewhere else. You just held it with me. She looked at her hands. So I am here, to hold some of whatever this is, until you can stand. I looked at the ceiling of the lodge, at the poles in the hide, at the smoke rising toward the hole. After a while I said, I was lying here thinking I was finished. You are not finished. No, but I was thinking it. I know. She put her hand over mine on the blanket, her working woman's hand, the cracked knuckles, the strong grip. I thought I was finished once. You waded into that river and handed me back my washing and stood there like you had all day. I almost smiled. You were shaking. I was terrified, but you just waited, like my being able to stand up again was a certainty you were prepared to wait for, whatever it took. We lay there for a while. She had sat down by then, fully, leaning against the frame of the lodge with my hand still in hers. The fire had gotten the lodge warm enough that the cold was something outside the walls rather than inside them, which was a relief in a way that went past temperature. I said, Margaret. Hello? What you said at the creek, about the shoe. She was quiet. That was not your fault, what happened. She didn't say anything. I have thought about it for a year. I have thought about everything you said, and I am telling you, that is not a fault. That is a terrible thing that happened to a woman who was holding on with everything she had. Those are different things. I felt her go still, the same still as before, the bird hearing a sound still. Then she said very low, "How do you know?" "Because I know you. I have watched you for 6 years. You do not let go of things. You hold on past what anyone should be able to hold. What happened in that river was the river." Silence. "I need you to hear me," I said, "because you have been carrying that judgment against yourself for 6 years, and it is wrong, and you are a woman who respects what is true, so I am telling you the truth." She made that sound again, the one from the creek, the one before crying. I waited. She cried. I held her hand. When it was done, she was quiet for a long time, and I was quiet, and the fire was doing its work, and outside I could hear the camp beginning. The sounds of mourning, children, dogs, the particular rhythm of people going about survival, even in the heart of it. She said, "I think I have been punishing myself for so long that I forgot what it felt like not to." Yes. Can that just stop? Can you just decide it stops? I don't know. I think you decide, and then you have to keep deciding every morning until one morning you don't have to decide anymore. It just is. She was quiet, thinking about that. "You sound like you know," she said. "I do some things right," I said. "Grief I have had to learn." She made a small sound, something between acknowledgement and affection, and then she just leaned her head back against the lodge frame and looked at the smoke hole the same way I had been looking at it when she came in. We stayed like that for a long time. Outside the day came all the way up, the light through the smoke hole going from gray to pale to the thin gold of a winter morning. The camp sounds grew and then settled into their midday rhythm. At some point, Winona knocked and called, and I said, "Not now," and Winona went away, which told me she could see enough through the door gap to understand what was there, and she understood it and went. Around midday she said, "Tell me something about Tatanka Win." I looked at the smoke hole. "She argued like you do," I said. "Not loud, but she didn't stop. She'd let me finish, and then she'd say, 'Yes, and then what?' And she'd wait. And she was usually right that the and then what was something I hadn't thought of." Margaret was quiet, listening. She could bead and talk at the same time. Full conversation, hands never stopping. I used to watch her hands. The way people reveal themselves in their hands, she was very precise, very exact. Even in conversation, when she was making a point with some passion, her hands would not miss a stitch. I always thought that was remarkable, the steadiness of it. "You are like that," she said. I looked at her. "Steady in two things at once," she said. "It is, I have noticed it. You can be present with a person and also present with what is around you. Most men pick one." I looked at the ceiling again. She used to say I read the room before I read the person. Maybe. But you read both. Is that good? She considered this with what I can only describe as seriousness. She gave things serious consideration. It was one of the things I liked about her, the way she didn't throw out quick words when the slow ones were what a question deserved. "It made me feel safe," she said. "From early on, I knew that you were never only looking at me, and so when you were looking at me, it was a choice." I thought about that. "Yes," I said. Outside, someone laughed. A child, somewhere near the edge of camp, laughing at something, a dog, probably, the big gray one that followed the children around in winter. The laugh was clear and bright in the cold air, the way sounds are in cold air, sharper, as if winter burns away the softness and leaves only what is real. She said, "I am staying. I want you to know that I know it now in a way I didn't before. I have been here 6 years and I have been staying, but I stayed the way you stay when you don't have anywhere else to go. This is different. I am choosing it." I looked at her. "I am choosing this," she said. "The camp, the people, Winona," she paused, "you." It took me a moment. I said, "You should know what that means, if you say it. Because people will talk and there will be things I cannot protect you from, opinions and... I know what it means. She looked at me steadily. I have been here 6 years. I know exactly what it means and who it involves and what the valley will say. I am not a woman who speaks before she has thought. Then say it again so I know you mean it. She looked at me with something in her face that was almost exasperated, which I had learned was a kind of affection on her, the way some people show warmth in the direction of impatience with the people they trust most. I am choosing you, she said. You specifically. The stubborn, quiet, proud, good man who waited at the creek when I couldn't stand up and sat on a cold ridge to show me the east wind and remembered my daughter's name when I couldn't say it. That man. There are moments in a life that you know, as they are happening, that you will be carrying them for as long as you carry anything at all. This was one. She was looking at me like I was something worth looking at. Like the sum of what I was, the losses and the years and the quiet and the work, like all of that added up to something she was glad to be near. I had not been looked at that way in 3 years. I reached out and put my hand against the side of her face, just for a moment, just to make it real in my hands the way real things become real. She leaned into it, slightly, the way something does when it has been waiting for a hand it can trust. I said, Clara would have been 10 this spring. She closed her eyes. She is not nothing, I said. She is counted in this lodge, she is counted. Margaret put her hand over mine, the one against her face, and she held it there. I got up that afternoon. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. Because there is a difference between standing up because you are responsible for people and standing up because the world contains something worth moving toward. And that day, for the first time in a long time, those two things were the same thing. The camp was going about its work and the cold was still what it was and the provisions were still short and none of the problems had changed. But I walked out into the afternoon and the air hit my face clean and cold and I looked out at the plains, at the flat white distance, and I felt not light. That is not the right word. Solid. The way a lodgepole feels when you test it and it doesn't give, when you know it will hold the weight you are about to put on it. Winona was by the fire in the middle of camp, and she looked at me when I came out, and she looked at me in that particular way she had that required no commentary. I walked over and sat with her. Hard winter, I said. Getting easier, she said. I looked at the fire. She said without looking at me. She spoke to that girl from the Eastern band who had been giving her trouble. Did it herself, no Chetan, no one. Said what needed to be said and waited for an answer. How did it go? The way it goes when the right person says the right thing at the right time. Winona picked up her work. She was always working, hands always moving, like she had a deal with the world to never let a spare moment pass unused. She has her voice back. Took you waking up to help her find it. She found it herself. Winona made a sound that meant she agreed and disagreed simultaneously, which was the most Winona thing she could do. The fire moved. The winter afternoon was short as they always are, and the cold came back with the dark, proper cold, the kind you take seriously and respect. I went around camp the way I always did in the evenings, checking in, making sure, talking to the people who needed talking to. I was the chief. That was the work and I was glad to be doing it standing up. But when I had done the rounds, when I had seen to what needed seeing to, I went back to my lodge. And after a while there was a knock, and I said come in, and she came in. She had her elk robe and she had a small pot of something that smelled like the tea Winona made, bitter and dark and good for cold bones. She set it by the fire and she sat, and I sat, and we drank the tea, which was good, bitter at the back of it the way good medicine is, the way most things worth having have some edge in them. She said, what is that on the wall there? She meant the piece of beadwork that Tatanka Wynne had made, and that I had hung there and never moved. I told her. She looked at it for a long time. The pattern, The colors, blue and white, and a dark red that Tatanka Wynne had gotten from a trader a year before she got sick, had been saving for something and had used for this. She had good hands, she said. Yes. We sat there in the firelight, and the cold was outside where it belonged, and the camp was quiet in the way it goes quiet after the last fires are banked, and the beadwork was on the wall where it had always been. And I did not feel like a smaller version of myself. I felt like the whole thing. That is not nothing, at 51 in the 7th winter of a hard life. That is not nothing at all. I want to tell you one more thing, because I am almost done, and it is the most true thing I have. She spoke first the next morning. When we woke, separately, I mean, she had gone to her own lodge, but we both rose early and I found her at the creek where the unfrozen water still ran in the center, breaking a hole in the ice at the edge to get to it. I walked down and helped her with the ice, and we stood there in the early dark, the water moving, our breath in the cold air, and she said good morning in Lakota, full Lakota, the right tones without thinking about it, the way you do a thing when it has finally become the thing you simply are. I said good morning back. And then she said, I want to plant something in spring. I have been thinking about it. There is a slope on the south side of the hill where the ground is good and the sun comes early. If we planted not a garden, I know, but something, she was working it out as she spoke, hands moving a little the way they did when she was thinking. Something that would be there every year, that would keep. I thought about the slope she meant. She was right about the ground, and she was right about the sun. What would you plant? I don't know yet. I'll think about it over the rest of winter and have it figured by spring. She looked at the water. Something that spreads, that comes back every year without needing to be tended every single day. Something that can take care of itself mostly. For Clara, I said. She looked at me, steady. Yes, she said, for Clara, and for having something that grows, that stays. Tell me when you know what. She looked at me with that almost exasperated look, the affectionate one. You are going to make me ask for everything, aren't you? I am going to make you say what you want. There's a difference. She looked at the water. Fair enough, she said. The creek moved. The dark was going, the east coming up pale and then faintly pink, the kind of pink you only get in winter when the air is cold enough to hold the color a little longer than it should. A new morning. She stood beside me, her shoulder near mine in the cold, both of us watching the water, and she was there, and I was there, and the camp was waking behind us, and somewhere beyond the ridge the plains went on for as far as I had ever ridden, which was far. I am an old man now telling you this, and I am telling you plainly, the way old men should tell things when they have finally lived long enough to understand them. A woman who chooses you, not because she has to, not because she is afraid, but because she looked at what you were, all of it, the grief and the years and the quiet and the cost, and decided you were worth choosing, that is a thing that cannot be replaced and should not be wasted. I had known it once and lost it, and I had told myself I was finished with that kind of being known. I was wrong. I was wrong to tell myself that, and the wrong nearly cost me something I did not know I still needed. She found her voice in the 7th winter, and when she did, she used it to call me back. I have been back ever since.